I will tell you about the woman who saved me. But first I need to tell you about the night I sat beside my wife's grave and asked her permission to keep living. That was the summer of 1883, the third summer without rain. The third summer I watched the grass turn from green to yellow to the color of old bone, watched the sky stay blue and empty and merciless from one end of Wyoming to the other, like God had pulled a clean sheet over the world and forgotten to take it back. The Mercer Ranch sat on 2,000 acres of that empty world, and most mornings I woke before first light and stood on the porch and looked out at what I had and felt nothing. Not despair, not anger, just nothing. Which, if you have ever been truly hollow, you know is the worst condition a man can find himself in. My name is Ethan Mercer. In the summer of 1883 I was 38 years old, and I had been a widower for 2 years, and the distance between those two facts had never felt smaller. People in Whitmore, the town 15 miles east of my land, had a word for what I had become. They called it grief, and they said it with a kind of reverence, the way people say a word when they mean something else entirely and do not have the courage to say the real thing. What they meant was that I had gone strange, that I had pulled in on myself like a snail finding its shell, that I came to town once a week for supplies, spoke to no one beyond what was necessary, and rode back out across the flat brown land without looking left or right. What they meant was that I had stopped being a person who participated in the world and had become instead a person who simply moved through it. They were not wrong. Ruth had died in August of 1881, and the truth of the matter, the truth I had not said aloud to anyone, was that a portion of me had died alongside her. Not the dramatic portion, not the portion that could be mourned and spoken over and eventually recovered, the quiet portion, the part of a man that makes him notice the color of the sky or the sound of the wind in the cottonwood trees or the particular weight of silence that settles over a ranch house when the person you love most in the world is no longer breathing inside it. I still worked. I still fed the cattle and mended the fences and drew water from the well and repaired what broke and replaced what could not be repaired. I did all the things a man does when he is trying to keep a ranch alive through the worst drought in 20 years, but I did them the way a machine does things, without feeling, without preference, without caring very much whether the effort succeeded or not. The well was the worst of it. Our well had been reliable since the day I dug it back in 1872, when Ruth and I first came to this land with nothing but a wagon and 2 horses, and the kind of optimism that only very young people or very foolish ones can sustain. 11 years later I was standing over that same well in the early morning dark, working the pump handle with both hands, listening to it groan and spit and yield up maybe half of what it used to yield, and thinking that the pump sounded like an old man who had been asked to do something he no longer had the strength for. I understood that feeling completely. It was on a Tuesday evening in late July, after a day of moving cattle from the east pasture to the north pasture, because the east pasture had gone completely bare, and the north pasture had maybe another week of sparse grazing left before it went bare too, that I walked up the low hill behind the house and sat down beside Ruth's grave. I did this sometimes, not every day, not even every week, but sometimes when the weight of the silence in the house had built up to something I could feel pressing against the inside of my chest, I would walk up that hill and sit in the grass and talk to her. Not pray. I had stopped praying the morning she died, not out of anger at anything in particular, but simply because prayer had come to feel like sending letters to an address that no longer existed. I just talked. The way you talk to someone who knows you well enough that you do not need to perform for them or choose your words carefully or worry about being judged. That evening I told her about the cattle. I told her about the well. I told her about the north fence that had lost 3 posts to the wind last week, and that I had spent most of Monday replacing alone because I no longer had a hired hand and could not afford one. I told her the small things, the daily things, the way I always had, and for a little while the weight in my chest eased slightly. Then I stopped. The sun was going down behind the hills to the west, painting the sky the color of embers, and I sat in the cooling grass, and I looked at the stone I had placed at the head of her grave, the simple gray stone with her name on it, and the years of her life and nothing else, because I had not been able to think of words adequate to the task, and I said what I had been circling around for weeks without being able to approach directly. "Ruth," I said, "I think I need to write a letter." The wind moved through the grass. A meadowlark called from somewhere down the slope. "Not the kind of letter where I am asking for anything for myself," I said. "You know I would not do that. But the ranch is in bad shape and the drought is not breaking and I cannot do everything alone anymore. I need help, practical help, someone who can work." I paused. "There is an agency in St. Louis," I said. "I saw it advertised in a newspaper. They arrange marriages, practical arrangements between men who need partners and women who need a place. Not romantic, just practical." The meadowlark called again, farther away this time. "I want you to know," I said, "that I am not trying to replace you. I do not believe you can be replaced. I do not believe that what we had is something a man finds twice in one life. But I also think that if you were here, if you were sitting beside me right now and looking at this land and looking at what I have let myself become these past 2 years, you would tell me to stop being a fool. You would tell me that the land needs tending and so do I, and that sitting up here talking to a stone is not the same as living." I sat there for a long time after that, long enough for the sky to go from red to purple to the deep blue black of full dark, and for the first stars to appear cold and clear and very far away. The wind did not answer me. The meadowlark had gone quiet, but I had been married to Ruth Mercer for 9 years, and I knew her well enough to know that her silence had never meant disagreement. It had meant, "I already told you what I think. Now stop waiting for permission and do the thing." I walked back down the hill in the dark. I wrote the letter that same night sitting at the rough-hewn table where Ruth and I had eaten 10,000 meals together, with the oil lamp casting its small yellow circle of light and the rest of the house pressing in dark and quiet around me. I wrote it 4 times. The first 3 versions I crumpled and fed to the stove, not because they were dishonest, but because they were trying too hard, reaching for a formality that did not suit a man writing by lamplight in a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and coffee and the particular kind of loneliness that accumulates in a place where someone used to be. The 4th version was the one I kept. It said, "I am Ethan Mercer, 38 years of age, widower, owner, and operator of the Mercer Ranch in Sweetwater County, Wyoming Territory. I am in need of a wife, not a companion in the romantic sense of that word, and not a woman who is expecting poetry or gentleness or the attention of a man whose heart is unoccupied. I have 2,000 acres, a sound house, adequate provisions, and enough work for 2 people. I am not given to drink or cruelty. I will treat a wife with fairness and respect. What I need is someone practical, someone unafraid of hard work and hard weather, someone who understands that this is a working arrangement and not a courtship. I do not require youth or beauty. I require capability and patience and a willingness to share the burden of keeping something alive. If there is a woman suitable to this arrangement, I would be grateful to hear from your agency at your earliest convenience." I read it back to myself once. Then I folded it, addressed the envelope to the matrimonial agency in St. Louis, and set it on the corner of the table where I would see it in the morning and not be able to pretend I had forgotten. I went to bed. I lay awake for a long time looking at the dark ceiling of the room where Ruth had died, listening to the wind outside pushing dust across the yard, and I thought about the empty chair across from mine at the table below, and I thought about what I had just set in motion, and I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Not happiness, not anticipation, just the faint, distant, almost unrecognizable sensation of a door being opened somewhere in the dark. I posted the letter the following morning. On my way out of Whitmore, I passed the post office and handed it across the counter to the postmaster without meeting his eyes, and then I rode back out toward the ranch and tried not to think about it. I was not entirely successful. I should tell you about Widow Hattie Greer, because she matters to this story more than I understood at the time. Hattie lived 5 miles east of my property on a small spread she had managed alone since her husband Clarence died 7 years before. She was 70 years old, lean and weathered as a fence post, with sharp gray eyes and the habit of appearing at inconvenient moments with a borrowed tool or a jar of something preserved from her garden or a piece of information that she offered without prelude and that you only later understood was important. She came by 2 days after I posted the letter. She was returning a bucket she had borrowed in the spring, which she carried in one hand as she walked across my yard in the early afternoon, moving with the unhurried certainty of a woman who has lived long enough to know that there is rarely any reason to hurry. I was on the porch writing a supply list. I looked up when I heard her boots on the step. "Hattie," I said. "Ethan," she said. She set the bucket down and looked at me with those sharp gray eyes. "I was filling out an envelope when I came by," she said. "For that agency in St. Louis, the matrimonial one." I had not told anyone about the letter. I said, "How did you know about that?" She shrugged one shoulder. I did not press her. Hattie Greer had her ways of knowing things, and pressing her about them had never yielded useful answers. I said, "It seemed like the practical thing." She looked at me for a moment. Then she nodded. Just once. A slow, deliberate nod, the kind that meant something more than simple agreement. "Good," she said. Then she turned and walked back across the yard toward the road, and I watched her go, and something about that nod stayed with me in a way I could not immediately account for. It was not the nod of a neighbor agreeing that a practical decision had been made. It was something else. It was the nod of a person who had been waiting for something to happen, and had just been informed that it was finally beginning. I did not understand that at the time. I do now. 5 weeks passed. 5 weeks of drought and fence repair and well pump work, and the slow grinding business of keeping a ranch alive when the land itself seems to have decided to stop cooperating. 5 weeks of waking before dawn and going to bed after dark and eating meals alone at the table with the empty chair across from me and trying not to look at it and looking at it anyway. Then the telegram came. I was in the barn mending a harness when I heard the boy from town coming up the road on his pony. He handed me the telegram through the barn door and waited while I read it the way boys do when they are hoping for a reaction worth reporting back. It said, "Bride departing Thursday morning. Arrives Whitmore Station noon Tuesday. Please be present to meet. Agency, St. Louis." I read it twice. Then I looked up at the boy who was watching me with wide, interested eyes. "Thank you," I said. He looked disappointed and rode away. I stood in the barn door with the telegram in my hand and looked out at the flat brown land stretching away to the hills, and I thought about Tuesday. 6 days. 6 days, and everything I had set in motion with that letter would arrive at Whitmore Station at noon in the form of a woman I had never seen who was coming to share my life, because I had advertised for someone to do exactly that. I looked over at the empty house. I thought about what I had asked for. Practical I had written, capable, unafraid of work. I do not require youth or beauty. Good, I thought. Good. That was the right thing to ask for. A plain woman, a sensible woman, someone whose presence would fill the silence without complicating things. Without making me feel anything I was not prepared to feel. I went back to mending the harness. That night I sat on the porch in the dark for a long time listening to the coyotes calling across the hills, and I thought about Ruth, and I thought about what she would say if she could see me now, and I decided she would say exactly what she had always said when I was making something more complicated than it needed to be. "Ethan," she would say, "stop thinking so hard and go to sleep." I went inside. I lay in the dark. I did not sleep for a very long time. Tuesday came with a sky the color of blue glass, clear and hard and hot by 8 o'clock in the morning, the kind of Wyoming summer day that makes you understand why the territory had driven out more homesteaders than it had kept. I dressed in my best clothes, which were not particularly good. A white shirt that was clean if not entirely unwrinkled. Dark trousers. The leather vest that Ruth had made for me in the second year of our marriage, cut from the hide of a steer we had butchered that winter. I had worn that vest to her funeral and I had not worn it since, and the fact that I was putting it on now for this occasion was something I chose not to examine too closely. My boots. I had polished the night before, though polishing them had felt like a strange performance, a gesture of respect to a situation I was not entirely sure deserved it. I hitched the horses to the wagon at 10 o'clock, which gave me plenty of time for the 15-mile drive to Whitmore, and I set off across the brown land under the hard blue sky alone on the seat, listening to the wheels on the dry road and the creak of the harness and the sound of the horses breathing and trying with very limited success to feel nothing in particular. The town of Whitmore appeared on the horizon after an hour, a collection of low wooden buildings gathered around a single main street like animals crowding around a water trough. It had a general store, a saloon, a church with a crooked steeple that had been crooked since a windstorm 3 years ago and would probably remain crooked until the church itself blew down. It had a post office, a small hotel, and since the railroad had come through in 1880, it had a station at the east end of the main street where the westbound trains stopped twice a week. I was early. I tied the horses at the rail outside the station and walked to the platform and found a place at the far end away from the small crowd that had already gathered. News traveled fast in Whitmore. The arrival of a mail-order bride, especially for the solitary rancher who had barely spoken to anyone in 2 years, was the kind of event that drew people the way a fire draws moths, not for warmth, but for the light. I stood at the end of the platform and looked down the tracks and waited. I heard what they were saying. Not all of it, but enough. "There's Mercer," said someone behind me. "Getting himself a wife by advertisement." "About time," said another voice. "Man's been out there alone since Ruth passed. That's not natural." "Wonder what she'll be like," said a third. "Agency women are usually, practical types. Not much to look at." I kept my eyes on the tracks. The train whistle sounded in the distance, a long, mournful note drifting across the flat land from somewhere east of the hills. Then the black smoke appeared rising against the blue sky, and then the locomotive itself came into view around the long eastern curve. Iron and steam and the grinding shriek of wheels, and it slowed and finally stopped at the platform in a great exhalation of white steam that rolled across the boards and left everything momentarily obscured. Passengers began to step down, a traveling salesman with a sample case, an elderly couple moving carefully down the steps, the man holding the woman's elbow. 2 young men I did not recognize, probably heading west to try their luck at something, a family with children who immediately spread across the platform like water finding its level. I watched each face. I was looking for a woman of middle years, capable-looking, sensible, someone whose presence announced that she was here for practical reasons and understood exactly what she had agreed to. That was what I had asked for. That was what I expected. Then she appeared in the doorway of the passenger car. She stood there for a moment before descending, one gloved hand resting on the rail, and she looked out at the platform the way a person looks at a room before entering it, not scanning for faces, not looking for the person who was supposed to meet her, looking at the space itself, looking at the exits, taking in the dimensions and the population and the possible complications before committing her weight to the first step down. I know now what that particular way of looking means. I did not know then, but I registered it, filed it away in some part of my mind that was paying attention even when the rest of me was not. She was young, younger than I had expected, certainly no more than 27, with hair the color of autumn wheat, pinned beneath a modest traveling hat. Her dress was plain cotton, dark blue, practical, in cut the dress of a woman who had not been trying to impress anyone when she packed her trunk. She carried herself straight, spine erect, chin level, the posture of someone who had learned to keep her head up as a matter of necessity rather than pride. And she was beautiful. I want to be precise about this because beauty is a word that gets used loosely applied to things that are merely attractive or merely young. And what I mean when I use it here is something different and more troubling. She was beautiful, the way certain pieces of country are beautiful, not ornamentally, not decoratively, but essentially in a way that is not about decoration at all, but about some fundamental quality of proportion and light. Fine-boned and clear-eyed, with a face that held its expression carefully, the way you hold something that might break if you grip it too hard. The crowd on the platform fell quiet in that particular way that crowds fall quiet when they encounter something they were not prepared for. "Lord Almighty," said someone near me, a man's voice, low and involuntary, the kind of thing a person says when they have forgotten they are speaking aloud. I stood at the end of the platform and felt the ground under my feet and thought with sudden and absolute clarity, this is not what I asked for. She descended the steps with careful dignity and stood on the platform boards and looked out at the crowd. Then her eyes found me. I do not know why they found me first. Perhaps it was the fact that I was standing apart from the others. Perhaps it was the vest, distinctive enough to have been described in the agency's correspondence. Perhaps it was simply the fact that I was the only person on that platform who was clearly not enjoying himself. Whatever the reason, her gaze found me and held, and I made myself walk toward her, which required more effort than it should have. "Miss," I said when I was close enough to speak quietly. I stopped because I realized with a jolt of embarrassment that I did not know her full name. The agency had sent only initials in the telegram. She looked at me with steady eyes the color of sage in late summer green-gray and difficult to read. She said, "Miss Nora Callahan. You must be Mr. Mercer." Her voice was quiet and even and did not waver. I said, "Yes. My wagon is this way." I reached for her trunk, which was small, a single piece of luggage, and as I lifted it I was aware of the crowd watching, aware of the whispers that were not really whispers at all, because people in small towns have never fully mastered the art of speaking quietly when they want others to know they are speaking. "That's her," a woman's voice said loud enough to carry. "That's who he sent away for. Can't be said another. A woman who looks like that doesn't answer advertisements unless she's running from something." "Or hiding something," said a man's voice. "The Garrison brothers." I recognized the tone. Always a Garrison brother somewhere when you needed an example of the worst impulses of human nature. Something wrong with her, you can count on it. No decent woman looks like that and needs to advertise herself. I saw Nora hear this. I saw it in the slight lift of her chin, the smallest adjustment barely perceptible, the kind of movement a person makes when they have decided not to let something reach them. She did not look toward the voices. She kept her eyes on the path in front of her. We walked to the wagon. I helped her onto the seat, not because she needed the help, but because it was the appropriate gesture, and she accepted it without comment. I stowed her trunk in the wagon bed and climbed up beside her and clicked to the horses, and we moved out of the station yard onto the main street, and I could feel the town watching us go, feel it on the back of my neck like sun. Neither of us spoke until we were clear of the buildings, and the road had opened up into the flat brown land stretching west toward the hills. Then she said, "You look disappointed." I kept my eyes on the road. I said, "I look practical." She said, "Those are the same thing, Mr. Mercer. You just said one of them out loud." I looked at her. Then this woman sitting straight-backed beside me on the wagon seat, hands folded in her lap, watching the land with those steady green-gray eyes. She was not afraid of me. She was not performing anything. She was simply sitting there, saying what she thought, and waiting to see what I would do with it. I said, "The agency was supposed to send someone suitable to a working arrangement." She said, "I can work. What I look like has no bearing on whether I can work." That was true. I had nothing to say to it. We rode in silence for a while. The land on either side of the road was brown and still broken occasionally by the twisted shape of a sagebrush or a cluster of dry grass that rattled in the small wind. The sky above was the same hard, merciless blue it had been all morning. She asked about the ranch. Practical questions, the kind you ask when you are taking inventory of a situation. How many head of cattle? How many outbuildings? How far to the nearest neighbor? I answered each question in the same measured tone she asked them, and between each exchange the silence settled back over us. Not uncomfortable exactly, but weighted the silence of two people who are both being careful. Then she asked, "How long have you been a widower?" 2 years, I said. She nodded and said nothing. Then, "Are you looking for help or for a way to forget?" I said, "What's the difference?" She said, "Everything." We did not speak again for a long time after that. I sat with her words and thought about them, and the horses walked and the land slid past, brown and dry and enormous, and the question she had asked sat in my chest like a stone that had been placed there very precisely in exactly the right location to be impossible to ignore. When the ranch came into view on the long western slope, a cluster of weathered buildings against the faded land, she looked at it for a long time without speaking. I said, "It is not much to look at right now." She said, "It is honest." I did not know what to make of that. We pulled into the yard. She climbed down before I could offer assistance, which I noticed. She stood in the dust of the yard and looked at the house, at the barn, at the dry garden plot beside the porch where Ruth had once grown things and where nothing had grown in 2 years. She turned slowly, taking the measure of what she had come to. I showed her the house. It was clean, or what passes for clean when a man has been living alone for 2 years, which is to say that the floors had been swept and the dishes were washed, but there was a spareness to everything, a bachelor's pragmatism that had gradually eliminated anything not strictly necessary. Ruth's curtains were still on, the windows. Faded now, the embroidery along the hems gone pale, and I saw Nora's eyes go to them and then away. Her room was the small chamber off the main room where Ruth had kept her sewing. A narrow bed, a washstand, a chest of drawers. I had put clean linens on the bed that morning, which had felt like the right thing to do, though the doing of it had cost me something I could not quite name. She set her trunk at the foot of the bed and looked at the room without expression. "It is private," I said. "The arrangement I am proposing is a practical one. You will have your room and I will have mine. We will share the work and the table, nothing more." She turned to look at me. She said, "That is what I expected. It suits me." There was something in her voice when she said that. Not relief exactly, but something close to it. Something that was about more than the simple acceptance of reasonable terms. We walked the property as the sun began its long descent. I showed her the well, working the pump handle to demonstrate how little effort it rewarded lately, and she watched with close attention, saying nothing but filing every detail away in a manner I was beginning to recognize as characteristic. At the chicken coop she counted the hens with quick eyes. At the barn she checked the cattle with the calm competence of someone who had grown up around livestock. At the garden plot she stopped. She crouched down and dug her fingers into the dry earth, working it in her palm, holding it up and looking at it in the late afternoon light. I said, "Nothing has grown there in 2 years. The soil is exhausted." She let the dirt fall through her fingers and rubbed what remained on her skirt and stood up. She said, "The soil is not exhausted. It is thirsty. There is a difference." I looked at the plot and then at her. She was already turning away, moving toward the barn to check the water trough. We ate supper that evening across from each other at the table I had eaten alone at for 2 years. She had found flour and made biscuits without being asked, and the smell of them had done something to the air in the kitchen that I was not prepared for, filling it with a warmth that had not been there in the morning, a warmth that was not sentimental but simply human, the simple human warmth of someone doing something ordinary in a shared space. We spoke little. When we did speak, we spoke about practical things: the well, the cattle, the schedule of the weekly supply run, the terms of the arrangement such as they were laid out plainly on both sides. When supper was done and the dishes cleared, she said she was tired from the journey and would retire. I stood when she rose, which was the habit Ruth had taught me, and she paused at the door to her room and looked back at me with those steady eyes. She said, "Thank you for meeting me, Mr. Mercer." "Ethan," I said before I could think about it. "If we are to be working partners, you should use my name." She considered this for a moment. Then, "Good night, Ethan." She went into her room and closed the door. I sat alone at the table for a long time. I listened to the small sounds of her settling in the soft scrape of the trunk being moved, the pour of water into the wash basin, the particular creak of the bed frame taking a new person's weight. Ordinary sounds, the sounds of a house being inhabited. I thought about what she had said in the wagon. "Are you looking for help or for a way to forget?" I got up and cleared the last of the dishes. I checked the latch on the front door and the window in the kitchen. I banked the fire in the stove and trimmed the wick of the oil lamp. And then on my way to my room I passed the corner of the table where she had laid her coat when we came in, and something on the floor caught the lamplight. A small piece of paper folded many times fallen from the coat's pocket. I picked it up. I should have set it on the table beside her coat without looking at it. Any decent man would have done exactly that. I held it in my hand for a moment, and then, I am not proud of this, I unfolded it. It was a newspaper clipping old enough to have gone yellow at the folds torn from what appeared to be a small regional paper. A few lines, the kind of brief notice that local papers run to account for deaths that do not warrant longer treatment. It read, "Patrick Callahan, 54, found near the North Ridge mining claim, Sweetwater County. Death determined accidental by Sheriff's Office. No surviving family known to reside in the area." I stood in the lamplight and read it twice. Callahan. Patrick Callahan. The name settled into my memory like a stone into still water, sending rings outward in all directions. I knew that name. Not well, not with any intimacy. But I knew it, and the knowing of it was attached to a morning 2 years ago when I had been sitting in Sheriff Burl Cassidy's office in Whitmore, signing a piece of paper at the sheriff's request, a form attesting that I had no knowledge of any mineral rights or claims associated with the parcel of land on my northern boundary that I had recently sold at below market value to a land agent acting on behalf of Douglas Hale. I had signed that form without reading it carefully. I had been 3 weeks out from burying Ruth, and I had not been sleeping, and I had not cared about anything very much, including the value of my own land, including what I was signing, including what any of it meant. Patrick Callahan had been found dead that same month. I stood in the lamplight with the clipping in my hand and thought about Nora Callahan, who was sleeping on the other side of a thin wall, who had traveled from somewhere east to answer an advertisement placed by a lonely rancher in Wyoming, who had asked me in the wagon whether I was looking for help or for a way to forget, who had arrived at the Mercer Ranch carrying a newspaper clipping about a dead man in her coat pocket. I set the clipping on the table beside her coat, folded exactly as I had found it. I went to my room. I lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about the name on that clipping and what it meant that the woman in the next room shared it, and what it meant that she had come here to this particular county, to this particular ranch, in response to this particular advertisement. She had not come here looking for a husband. She had come here looking for something her father had died for. And I, without knowing it, without intending it, had signed my name to the document that may have made his death possible. I lay there in the dark for a very long time, listening to the wind outside and the small sounds of her breathing on the other side of the wall. Outside, somewhere in the hills, a coyote called. The sound rose and hung in the darkness, and then faded, and the night came back in around it, enormous and still, and full of things that had not yet been said. The first 3 weeks passed, the way hard things pass when two people have agreed without speaking it aloud to be careful with each other. We rose before dawn, both of us arriving in the kitchen within minutes of each other each morning, as though we had synchronized our habits without discussion, which in a way we had the way two people in a small space inevitably begin to orbit each other's rhythms, whether they intend to or not. I would find the fire already lit when I came in, or she would find the coffee already made, and neither of us remarked on it, because remarking on it would have meant acknowledging that we were paying attention to each other, and we had both decided separately and for our own reasons that paying attention was a thing to be done quietly, without announcement. She worked without complaint. That was the first thing I registered, and it mattered more than it might sound, because complaint is such a natural human response to difficulty that its absence becomes its own kind of information. The Mercer Ranch in the summer of 1883 was not a comfortable place to be. The heat was relentless. The dust got into everything. The well pump required muscle and patience to yield anything useful, and the list of tasks that needed doing on any given day was long enough to exhaust a man who had been doing this work for years. Nora Callahan had been doing it for 3 weeks, and she had not once, not in my hearing, expressed anything that could be interpreted as dissatisfaction. She swept the floors and washed the dishes and hauled water and gathered eggs and fed the chickens and mended what needed mending and cooked 2 meals a day from the supplies we had, which were adequate without being generous. She did all of this with the quiet efficiency of someone who had grown up understanding that work is not a performance and does not require an audience to be meaningful. But it was the other things I noticed. The way she studied the land when she thought I was not watching, standing at the kitchen window in the early morning, or pausing at the fence line on her way to the chicken coop, looking out at the brown expanse with an expression that was not admiring and not despairing, but something in between the expression of a person reading a document in a language they are still learning. the way she asked questions that were precise rather than general. Not how do you manage the cattle, but how many head are on the north pasture, and when did you last move them, and what was the grass situation there before the drought came. Not how do you handle the well, but how deep did you dig it, and which direction does it run, and has the yield changed gradually or all at once. She was cataloging something, building a picture from fragments. I knew what it felt like because I had watched Ruth do something similar in the early years of our marriage, learning the ranch the way you learn a person detail by detail until the whole of it was familiar enough to move through without thinking. But Nora Callahan was not learning the ranch the way a wife learns a place she intends to make her home. She was learning it the way a surveyor learns terrain he has been sent to map. I kept the newspaper clipping to myself. I had decided in the days after finding it that whatever she was looking for was her business until she chose to make it mine, and that pressing her before she was ready would only close the doors between us more firmly than they were already closed. So I worked beside her and ate across from her and spoke to her about practical things, and I waited, and I carried the knowledge of that clipping the way you carry a splinter. You cannot quite reach present in every movement, impossible to forget. It was in the third week that the wolves came. I had been watching for them. The tracks had appeared first at the outer edge of the east pasture, large prints in the dry mud around the water trough spaced with the easy confidence of animals that have decided a territory belongs to them. I had seen wolves before, had dealt with them before, but these were different, bolder, closer to the buildings. The drought had pushed their usual prey further into the hills, and they had followed the easier opportunity down toward the flatland, toward the cattle that were too weakened by heat and poor grazing to run effectively. I told Nora at supper. I said, "We will need to keep watch tonight. I will take the first shift." She looked up from her plate and said, "I can shoot." I said, "You can." It was not a question, but she answered it anyway. She said, "My father taught me. He said a woman alone needs to know how to protect what matters to her." There was something in the way she said it, a particular flatness in the phrase "my father," the flatness of a word being held carefully because what it contains is too much for the present moment. I noticed it and did not pursue it. She said I brought my rifle. I had not known this. I looked at her across the table, and she looked back at me steady and unrevealing, and I thought that there was a great deal about this woman that I did not know, and that the shape of what I did not know was becoming clearer by the day, even as its content remained opaque. I took the first watch. 3 hours on the porch, the rifle across my knees, the night enormous around me, the stars so thick and low in the Wyoming sky that they seemed almost close enough to reach. The cattle were restless in the barn, shifting and lowing softly, and twice I heard something move in the darkness beyond the fence line, something careful and patient, and I watched and waited, and nothing showed itself. At midnight, Nora appeared at the door fully dressed, her hair braided back, her rifle in her hands, the same rifle she had mentioned at supper, a Winchester that she carried with the ease of long familiarity. She said, "Go sleep." I said, "If they come close to the barn, wake me. Do not handle 3 of them alone." She said, "I know how many wolves I can handle alone, Ethan. Go sleep." I went inside. I lay down on my bed without undressing and listened through the window and through the thin wall of the house. I could hear her settling onto the porch step, the small sounds of her making herself comfortable for a long wait. I did not sleep. Through the window I could see her silhouette against the stars, straight-backed, attentive, the rifle resting across her knees exactly as mine had been. Once in the early hours before dawn, a wolf howled from the ridge to the north, a long, wavering sound that stretched out over the dark land and echoed off nothing. The cattle stirred. Nora stood, moved to the fence line, stood there for several minutes looking out into the dark, then returned to the step. She did not flinch. She did not hurry. She moved with the deliberate calm of someone who has decided in advance how they will respond to danger and does not need to make that decision again in the moment. The attack came just before first light, which is when they always come, in that gray, undecided hour when the darkness is loosening its grip but the light has not yet arrived to replace it, when human alertness is at its lowest ebb and the animals know it. I heard Nora's rifle first, a sharp crack that split the pre-dawn quiet and brought me off the bed and out the door in the same motion, rifle in hand, boots still unlaced. She was at the fence firing, and one wolf was already down and two more were circling, hesitating, the hunger and the caution fighting each other in the way they always do when something unexpected has happened. I came up beside her at the fence rail. She said without looking at me, "The one on the left is moving to flank." I tracked it, fired. The wolf yelped and veered away, wounded, vanishing into the gray pre-dawn. The third stopped, assessed the situation with those cold yellow eyes, and then turned and melted back into the darkness without sound. We stood at the fence in the gray light, watching the place where they had been. After a moment I looked down at the wolf she had shot. The shot was clean and precise, placed exactly where it needed to be placed. I looked at it for a moment, and then I looked at her. I said, "Where did a woman learn to shoot like that?" She was already turning away from the fence, moving back toward the house. She said, "When you have something worth protecting, you learn." She said it quietly, without drama, the way you say something that is simply true. And she walked back to the house and went inside, and I stood alone at the fence in the growing light and thought about those words and felt them land somewhere deeper than their surface meaning reached. In the days that followed the wolf attack, something shifted between us. Nothing dramatic, nothing that could be pointed to as a moment. But the careful distance we had been maintaining, the deliberate space of two strangers being polite in a small house, contracted slightly the way a rope contracts when weight is applied to it. She had proven something. Not to me, or not only to me, but to the situation itself. She was not here to be taken care of. She was not here to occupy a role. She was here to work, and she could do it, and the doing of it beside someone changes the nature of the space between you, whether you intend it to or not. I watched her, and I tried to watch her the way a man watches a capable colleague, with appreciation and nothing more, and I was not entirely successful. It was on a Wednesday afternoon in the 4th week that she led me to the cottonwood trees. There were 3 of them growing in a shallow depression about 200 yards northeast of the house, in a spot I had walked past 1,000 times without giving them particular attention. They were not impressive trees. Stunted and wind-bent, their trunks no thicker than a man's thigh, their canopy sparse and irregular, but they were alive. In a landscape where everything else had surrendered to the drought, these 3 trees were maintaining something, holding on to something, drawing from somewhere a thread of moisture sufficient to keep them standing. Nora stopped beside them and looked at them for a long moment. She said, "Do you know why these trees are alive when everything else around them is dead?" I said. "I have wondered about it." She crouched and pressed her palm flat against the earth between the roots. She held it there, feeling something I could not see. She said, "My father taught me to read land. Not the surface of it, the bones of it, what it is doing underneath, where the water runs, where it pools, where it gets caught between layers of rock and sits waiting for something to reach it." She looked up at me. She said, "There is water here, not deep, but real. Your current well is 50 yards in the wrong direction and twice as deep as it needs to be. This is where you should have dug." I looked at the trees and at the ground and at her. I said, "I have been farming this land for 11 years. She said, "I know. And these trees have been here longer than that. They have been trying to tell you something the whole time." I could have argued. I had reasons to argue, 11 years of reasons, the accumulated certainty of a man who knows his own land. But I looked at those 3 trees, alive and stubborn in the dead brown landscape, and I thought about everything Nora Callahan had demonstrated in 4 weeks of living on this ranch. The precision of her questions, the sharpness of her observations, the way she had understood the wolf attack before it happened, and I thought, what kind of fool argues with a woman like this about the land she is trying to help him save? I said, "When do we start?" She stood up and looked at me with something in her eyes that was not quite surprise and not quite satisfaction, but a small, careful version of both. She said, "Tomorrow morning, before it gets hot." We started at first light. Digging a well by hand in July in Wyoming is work of a particular brutality. The ground is iron hard for the first 2 feet, soft and sandy for the next 2, and then iron hard again as you go deeper, the layers alternating without pattern or mercy, each one requiring a different approach and a different set of muscles. We took turns with the single shovel, one digging, while the other rested, switching every 15 minutes or whenever the one digging could no longer maintain an effective pace. By mid-morning we were 4 feet down and streaming sweat, and the sun was directly overhead, and the sky was the same white-hot blue it had been every day for months, and I said, "We should stop for water." She climbed out of the hole and took the canteen I offered and drank from it and handed it back and said, "How far down do you think it is?" I said, "I do not know. Could be 8 feet. Could be 15. She looked at the hole. She said, 8. Maybe less. I said, "What makes you think that?" She said, "The same thing that makes those trees think it." I looked at her. She looked back at me. There was dust on her face, and her hair had come loose from its pins, and her dress was stained with soil from the waist down, and she was the least performative person I had ever been in the presence of a quality I was finding increasingly to be one of the most striking things about her. We dug through the afternoon. The hole went to 5 feet, then 6, then 6.5, and the sun began its long descent toward the hills, and the air began to cool slightly, and I was leaning on the shovel in the bottom of the hole thinking about the futility of this particular effort when the blade of the shovel went into the earth and came back up dark, visibly darker than the soil around it, and I crouched down and pressed my fingers into it and felt the coolness there, the faint yielding of earth that has moisture in it. I said, "Nora." She was sitting on the edge of the hole, her legs dangling down. She looked at the soil in my hand and let out a breath, a long, slow breath, and then she laughed. Not a polite sound, a real one, sudden and full. The laugh of a person who has been holding tension in her body for a very long time and has just been given permission to release it. The laugh transformed her face entirely. It cracked open the careful composure she had been maintaining since the moment I first saw her on the platform in Whitmore, and what was underneath it was not something fragile or guarded but something luminous, the kind of joy that only comes to people who have earned it. I stood in that hole 6 feet deep with dark wet soil on my hands and looked up at her laughing on the rim against the evening sky and felt something I had not felt in 2 years open in my chest, like a door swinging wide, and I knew with the same cold clarity with which a man knows when he has made an irreversible mistake that I was in serious trouble. We sat on the edge of the finished hole as the stars came out tired and dirty and quietly triumphant. The tension of the day had burned off with the afternoon heat, and what remained in its place was something lighter, a companionship that had been earned through shared effort, which is the most durable kind. She said my father had what people called a touch for water. He said it was not a gift, it was just paying attention to what the land was trying to tell you. She paused. Then, he said most people look at land and see what they want to see, or what they are afraid to see. The land does not lie, he said. People lie to themselves about what they are looking at. I said, "He sounds like someone worth knowing." She did not answer immediately. The silence stretched, and in it I felt the weight of what she was not saying, the shadow of the newspaper clipping in my pocket that I had been carrying for weeks, and I thought, here. This is the moment. If you are going to say something, say it now. But she spoke first. She said, "He is gone. He died 2 years ago." I said, "I am sorry." She nodded slowly, looking out at the dark land. She said, "He died in this county. That is part of why I am here." I waited. She said, "That is not the whole reason, but it is part of it." And then she stood up and brushed the soil from her skirt and said she was going in to make supper, and the moment closed, and we went inside and ate across from each other at the table by lamplight, and I thought about what she had said and what she had not said, and carried it all into the night with me, where it joined everything else I was carrying heavy and unresolved. That night after supper we sat on either side of the kitchen table in the lamplight, neither of us quite ready to retire the way people sometimes linger after a meal, when the day has been long enough and eventful enough that going to sleep feels like it would leave something incomplete. Nora was mending one of my shirts, a task she had taken on without being asked, working the needle through the fabric with the small, precise movements of someone who had been doing this since childhood. I was supposed to be reading a 2-week-old newspaper I had picked up on the last supply run, but I had been looking at the same paragraph for 20 minutes without taking in a word of it. The lamp between us threw a pool of steady amber light across the table, warm enough to work by, not quite enough to read by, which suited me well enough since I was not reading anyway. Outside, the wind had come up pushing against the windows, and somewhere out in the dark the cattle were settling for the night with their low, unhurried sounds. I said, "What did your father do before Wyoming?" She kept her eyes on her work. She said, "He was a miner. He moved around a lot. Montana, then Nevada, then here. He had a talent for finding things that other people had overlooked." I thought about Patrick Callahan, 54, found near the North Ridge mining claim. I thought about the careful, neutral language of that clipping, the way it had been written to say as little as possible while appearing to say something. I said, "He found something here." A pause. The needle moved through the fabric. She said, "He believed he did. He was working a claim on the North Ridge just above the county line. He wrote to me that he had found something promising, that he wanted to register it properly before he said any more about it. 2 weeks later he was dead. The lamp flame bent in a draft from somewhere. I said the sheriff's report called it an accident." She looked up at me. The first time she had done so in this conversation, and the look was not accusatory, not quite, but it was direct, and it registered the fact that I knew more about this than I had pretended to. She said, "You know about his death." I said, "I know his name. I heard about it at the time." She put the shirt down on the table. She said, "How do you know his name, Ethan?" I had been deciding how to answer this question for 3 weeks. I had turned it over in my mind every night since finding the clipping, constructing and rejecting various approaches, trying to find the version of the truth that was honest without being devastating. But sitting across the table from her in the lamplight with the needle set down, and her hands still, and her eyes on me, I understood that there was no version of the truth that was both honest and not devastating, and that choosing honesty was not about finding a comfortable way to say it, but simply about saying it. I said, 2 years ago, a few weeks after my wife died, a land agent came to me on behalf of Douglas Hale. He wanted to buy the parcel on my northern boundary, the 40 acres that runs up to the ridge line. He offered below market value, and I knew it was below market value, but I was not in any condition to argue or to ask questions. I signed the paper he put in front of me. One of those papers was a form attesting that I had no knowledge of any mineral claims or rights associated with that parcel. She was very still. I said I did not read what I signed. I was 3 weeks out from burying my wife, and I had not slept properly in a month, and I did not care about anything very much, including the value of my own land, and including what my signature might mean for anyone else. I signed it because it was put in front of me and someone asked me to, and I had stopped being the kind of man who asks questions. The wind pushed at the windows. The lamp flame bent again. She said, "You signed a document clearing the way for Hale to claim land that bordered my father's claim." I said yes, without knowing that. Without knowing anything about Patrick Callahan or what he had found or what Douglas Hale was building toward. I signed it because I was not paying attention, and I have been living with that for 2 years, though until 3 weeks ago I did not know the full weight of what it meant. She looked at me for a long time. Long enough that I felt every second of it, the measured quality of her assessment, the careful process of a woman deciding what a piece of information means and what it is worth and what she is going to do with it. She said, "You kept the clipping, the one from my coat." I said I found it when it fell. I should have put it back without looking at it. She said, "But you did look at it." I said, "Yes." She said, "And you did not say anything. For 3 weeks. I said I was waiting for you to be ready." She looked at me for another long moment. Then she looked down at the shirt on the table between us. She said, "That is either very respectful or very convenient." I said, "I know." She picked the shirt up again. The needle moved. After a while she said, "My father knew something was wrong. He wrote to me that the land agent Hale's man had been to see him asking about the claim. He said the man was persistent in a way that made him uncomfortable. He said he was going to register the claim formally and send me the documentation for safekeeping." She paused. She said, "The documentation never arrived." 2 weeks later, I received a letter from the county sheriff informing me that my father had been found dead near the claim site and that the death had been ruled accidental. No further investigation was conducted. I said, "I am sorry." She said, "That is the second time you have said that." I said, "I mean it both times." The needle moved, the wind moved, the lamp flame held. She said, "I came here because his last letter mentioned Sweetwater County and a rancher named Mercer whose land bordered the North Claim. He mentioned you as someone who might have information or might be someone Hale approached. He did not know which. So I was both." I did not say that aloud, but I thought it, and I think she knew I was thinking it because she did not look up from her work. I said, "What are you looking for?" She said, "He told me he had prepared documentation, proof of the claim's legitimacy, and proof of what Hale was doing to acquire the land around it. He said he had hidden it somewhere safe. He did not tell me where in the letter. He said he would tell me in person." I said, "And there was no person?" She said, "There was no person." We sat with that for a moment. Then I told her what I had been holding back for 3 weeks. I told her about Hattie Greer's nod, the strange, deliberate quality of it, the sense I had carried since that afternoon, that Hattie knew something she was waiting to disclose at the right moment. I told her about the way Hattie had asked without any apparent reason to ask whether I had sent the letter to St. Louis. I told her that Hattie Greer had been in this county for 40 years and knew things about the people and the land here that most people did not know and did not think to ask about. Nora listened to all of this without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We should speak with her." I said, "In the morning." She said, "Yes." And there it was. Not a romantic declaration, not a dramatic turning point, just two people sitting across a table in lamplight, both in possession of pieces of the same puzzle, both deciding at the same moment that they were going to work on it together. We sat for a while longer without speaking. The shirt got mended. The newspaper remained unread. The wind outside slowly quieted. And somewhere in the course of that ordinary evening, without ceremony, without announcement, the arrangement between us became something with more weight than an arrangement, though neither of us said so, and neither of us would have known how to say it if we had tried. It was the morning after this conversation, a Thursday, when Douglas Hale arrived. I was at the fence on the south side of the barn, replacing a post that had worked itself loose from the dry ground when I heard the horse. Not the plodding, even-paced sound of a ranch horse or a farm horse, but the measured, deliberate stride of a thoroughbred, a horse bred for quality and maintained for appearance, a horse that announced something about its rider before the rider himself came into view. I straightened and looked toward the road. The man who rode into my yard was everything the horse promised. He was perhaps 50, broad-shouldered and well-made, wearing a suit that fit him with the particular precision that costs money to achieve. His face was handsome in the manner of things that have been shaped by will as much as nature, the face of a man who has decided what he wants to look like and arranged himself accordingly. He had pale gray eyes that moved with a quick, controlled intelligence, cataloging the yard and the barn and the house, and then finally me. He drew up the horse and looked down at me with a pleasant expression. He said, "You would be Mercer." It was not a question which told me something. Men who ask whether you are who they think you are have not already confirmed it through other means. This man had confirmed it. I said, "I am, and you are on my land." He swung down from the horse with practiced ease, the ease of a man who has spent his life moving between positions of authority and has never found the transitions difficult. He tied the horse to the fence post as though the fence post was his to use, which was the kind of small presumption that tells you everything about how a person understands the world. He said, "Douglas Hale. I believe we have a mutual acquaintance in the county recorder's office. You signed some paperwork for me a couple of years back." Indirectly. I said nothing. He looked around the yard with the appraising gaze of a man assessing value, not the value of things he wants to buy, but the value of things he already considers his. He said, "I heard you acquired a bride through the St. Louis agency. Congratulations. A man out here alone is only half a man in my view. We all need someone to work alongside." His eyes went past me to the house. Calculated. Patient. He said, "I understand her name is Callahan." The way he said it. not the name itself but the way he said it, with the careful, neutral tone of a man who has prepared in advance to say a word that matters and has practiced keeping it neutral. I said, "My wife's name is my business." He smiled, a practiced smile, the kind that has been used so many times it has lost its connection to anything the face might actually be feeling. He said, "Of course. Forgive me, I only mention it because I believe I knew her father, Patrick Callahan. Worked a claim up on the North Ridge for a while. Unfortunate business what happened to him." He paused, and in the pause placed just enough weight to be a message, not enough to be a statement. He said I would hate for unfortunate things to run in families. I looked at him. He looked at me with those pale gray eyes, pleasant and attentive, and entirely without warmth. I said, "I think you should finish whatever business brought you out here and then leave." He said, of course. I only wanted to introduce myself, neighbor to neighbor. We share a boundary line after all, or nearly so. The parcel on your North Ridge that you sold a couple of years back now borders my holdings. I like to know the people whose land touches mine, good fences and all that." He untied his horse and remounted with that same practiced ease. He said, "Please give my regards to your wife. Tell her that Sweetwater County is a hospitable place for people who understand how things work here, and perhaps a less hospitable place for those who are determined to misunderstand it." He turned the horse and rode back out the way he had come, unhurried, the thoroughbred moving with that same measured aristocratic stride. I stood in the yard and watched him go. The kitchen door opened behind me. Nora came out carrying a basket. She stopped when she saw the direction of my gaze the road the diminishing figure on the black horse. She said, "Who was that?" I said, "Douglas Hale." She set the basket down on the porch step. She was very still. I turned to look at her, and what I saw on her face in that moment was not fear, which is what I had expected, but something colder and more controlled. The expression of a person who has been waiting a long time for a specific thing to happen and has now watched it happen and whose preparations are accordingly now in effect. She said, "What did he say?" I told her. All of it precisely and without omission, including the part at the end about hospitable places and people who understand how things work. She listened without expression. When I finished, she picked up the basket again. She said, "He came to see if I was here, and to deliver a message." I said yes. She said, "He already knew I was here before he rode in." I said, "That is my reading of it." She nodded slowly, and in the nod I saw the same thing I had seen in Hattie Greer's nod weeks ago. The acknowledgement of something that had already been known, the accommodation of a fact that had always been coming. She said, "We need to go see Hattie Greer. Today. Not tomorrow." I said I will hitch the wagon after dinner. But it was what she said next, spoken quietly, half to herself, looking out at the road where Hale had gone, that stayed with me through the afternoon and into the night. She said, "He was in love with my mother once, before she chose my father. A long time ago." She said it the way you say something that changes the shape of everything around it, not as a revelation but as a context, a piece of information that reframes other pieces. And I stood in my yard in the summer heat and felt the ground shift underneath the thing I thought I understood, because a man who wants land is dangerous in one way, and a man who has been carrying a 25-year-old wound and has finally found a way to act on it is dangerous in an entirely different and less predictable way. We went to Hattie Greer's that afternoon. She was in her garden, such as it was, working among the dry rows with the patience of a woman who had been gardening in Wyoming long enough to understand that some years the garden wins and some years it does not, and either way you keep showing up. She straightened when she saw our wagon coming down the road and stood watching us pull up to her gate with an expression I could not read from a distance. When I climbed down and helped Nora down and we walked toward her, I saw that expression resolve into something I could read. It was recognition. Not of Nora specifically, I did not think she had seen Nora before, but recognition of a situation, of two people arriving together at the right moment. She looked at Nora for a long time. She said, "You are Patrick's daughter." Nora said, "Yes." Hattie set down her gardening tool and said, "Come inside. I have been waiting for you. Longer than you know." We went inside into the small, cool interior of Hattie Greer's house, which smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke, and the particular staleness of old paper. And Hattie went to the shelf beside her fireplace and reached up to the back of it behind a row of preserving jars and brought down a small flat package wrapped in oilcloth. She set it on the table in front of Nora. She said, "Your father brought this to me 3 days before he died. He said if something happens to me, Hattie give this to my daughter if she comes looking. He said she will come. She is that kind of person." Nora looked at the package on the table. She did not reach for it immediately. She looked at it the way you look at something that has been a long time in the coming, something whose arrival you have needed and feared in equal measure. She said, "What is in it?" Hattie said, "I did not open it. It was not mine to open." Then she said, and here her voice shifted, took on a quieter and more specific weight, "He also told me something else. He said, tell her that Douglas Hale's claim to the North Ridge land is built on documents that were obtained through pressure and misrepresentation. He said there are names on those documents that should not be there. Men who signed things they did not understand in bad moments when they were not themselves." Her eyes moved to me. I felt the room become very still. She said, "He said one of those men was a rancher named Mercer, who had just lost his wife, who signed because he was grieving and not paying attention. He said that man is not guilty of anything except being human at the wrong time. He said if Nora finds him, tell her he is not her enemy." The three of us sat in the small room. Outside through the window I could see the flat land stretching away under the afternoon sky, brown and dry and enormous, holding everything that had been buried in it, everything that had happened on top of it, everything that was going to happen. Nora reached out and put her hand on the oilcloth package. She said, "Thank you, Hattie." She picked it up and held it against her chest, and she closed her eyes for just a moment, and in that moment her face was not composed or guarded or strategic. It was just the face of a woman who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has just been told for the first time that she does not have to carry it alone anymore. I looked at her and thought about the man on the black horse, and the package on her chest, and the dry land all around us, and the well we had dug together, and everything that was about to come. I thought, this is where the easy part ends. I was right about that, but I was wrong about what I thought I was strong enough for. We rode back from Hattie Greer's in the long golden light of late afternoon, the wagon moving slowly through the dry land with the package in Nora's lap, and the silence between us carrying more weight than it had ever carried before. She held the oilcloth bundle the way a person holds something they have been searching for long enough that finding it feels less like relief and more like the beginning of a different kind of difficulty. I did not rush her. We got back to the ranch, and I unhitched the horses and fed them and checked the cattle and did the small end-of-day things that needed doing. And when I came inside, Nora was at the table with the package open before her, reading by the last of the daylight through the kitchen window. She did not look up when I came in. I set water on the stove and went about making supper, working quietly around her the way you work around someone engaged in something that matters, giving them the space the task requires. When the food was on the table, she put the papers together, carefully stacked them in order, and set them beside her plate. She said, "He kept records of everything." I waited. She said every meeting with Hale's agent, every document he was shown and asked to sign, every conversation that struck him as irregular. He wrote it all down in the order it happened, with dates and names, and he had it witnessed by 2 people whose names I recognize as honest men from the county records. She looked at the stack of papers. She said, he knew. He knew from very early on that something was wrong, that the land agent was not what he presented himself as, that the transactions Hale was engineering were designed to look like ordinary business while being something else underneath. He knew, and he documented it, and he hid the documentation with Hattie because he understood that if anything happened to him, the papers could not be found at his claim site or his rooms. She paused. She said, he did all of this alone. He had no one to help him, no lawyer, no influential connections, nothing but his own careful attention and the judgment to know that paper survives when people do not. She was quiet for a moment after that, and I let the quiet stand because there was no word I could offer that would be adequate to what she was sitting with. Her father had been right about the danger, and had prepared against it as well as a man alone could prepare, and he had died anyway, and the papers had survived, and now they were here on a kitchen table in the ranch house of a man whose signature appeared in the margins of the very wrong her father had spent his last weeks trying to document. I said, "What does it say about the land, about the claim?" She sorted through the papers and drew out a page near the bottom of the stack. She said, "He registered the claim in my name 3 days before he died. The registration is dated, witnessed, and properly filed according to the county recorder's procedure. Hale's subsequent claim to the same land is dated 2 weeks later, and is built on documents that describe the North Ridge parcel as unclaimed and unworked, which was a lie. My father had been working it for 4 months. I said the county recorder who accepted Hale's filing would have needed to miss your father's prior registration, or decide not to see it. She said yes. We looked at each other across the table. I said, "Burl Cassidy has been sheriff here for 9 years. He signed the accident report on your father's death. He also witnessed one of the land transfer documents that Hale used to consolidate the North Ridge holdings. His name is on the paper." She said, "I know. I saw it." I said, "That does not necessarily mean he is Hale's man. It might mean he was used the same way I was. A name on a document signed in circumstances he did not fully understand." She said, "Or it might mean he understood perfectly." I said, "Yes, it might mean that." We ate supper in the weight of everything we had not yet resolved, and afterward Nora washed the dishes and I dried them, and we moved around each other in the small kitchen with the ease of people who have been sharing a space long enough that the logistics of it have become automatic. And in the ordinary rhythm of that, I felt something that I recognized with a jolt, as contentment quiet and unannounced, the kind that settles into the bones when you are somewhere you are supposed to be with someone you are supposed to be with. I did not say that, but I felt it, and feeling it scared me more than Douglas Hale had scared me, because Hale was a threat I could see and account for, and this was a threat of a completely different order. That night I could not sleep. I lay in my room in the dark and listened to the house and thought about everything that was coming and everything that was at stake, and somewhere around midnight I made a decision that I had been circling for days, approaching and retreating from the way you approach something hot, testing the temperature before you commit. I got up. I dressed quietly. I took my hat from the hook by the door and went out into the night. The sky was enormous, above me thick with stars. The Milky Way, a river of cold light stretching from one end of the world to the other. The air had the particular cleanness of Wyoming nights in summer, cool and dry, and carrying the smell of sage. And I walked up the low hill behind the house with the grass whispering around my boots, and stood at Ruth's grave in the starlight. I had been here many times. I had talked to her many times. But I had always come here carrying the grief of her absence like a weight I was trying to set down for a moment, and this time was different. This time I was not coming to unburden. I was coming to say something specific, something I had owed her since the night I posted a letter to an agency in St. Louis and set something in motion that I had not fully understood. I took my hat off and held it in both hands and looked at the stone with her name on it. I said, "Ruth, I need to tell you something." The stars were very bright. The wind moved through the grass in long, slow waves. I said, "I think I am falling in love with her. I am not going to pretend otherwise, not to you. I do not fully understand it yet, and I am not certain what to do with it, but I know what I feel, and you always said that knowing what you feel and pretending not to are not the same as being strong. They are just two different kinds of lying." I stopped. I said, "She is not you. She is not anything like you. She is harder in some ways, more guarded. She has built walls that yours never needed to be, because she has lived a life that required them. But she is brave in a way that I recognize. She is honest in a way that costs her something. She is trying to do right by her father the way I should have tried to do right by the people around me when you died, and I did not. And she is making me understand what it would have looked like if I had." The wind moved. I said, "I think you would like her. I think if you met her, you would sit across the table from each other and talk for hours, and I would not be able to get a word in, which is what always happened when you decided someone was worth knowing. I stood there for a long time after that, not speaking, just standing in the dark with the stars overhead and the wind in the grass, and I thought about Ruth Mercer, who had been the best part of 9 years of my life, who had made this land feel like a home and not just a piece of ground, who had laughed at my jokes even when they were not funny and argued with my decisions when she thought I was wrong, and been right often enough that I had learned to listen. I thought about the fact that she was gone, truly gone, not away, not absent, not waiting somewhere, but gone, in the complete and permanent way that death is gone, and that there was no version of the future in which she came back, and that I had known this for 2 years, but had not yet finished grieving it, because I had confused grieving her with staying close to her, as though the grief itself was the last remaining form of loyalty. It was not. The loyalty had been in the living. In the 9 years we had built together, in the way she had changed what I understood about myself, in the things she had taught me that I carried without knowing I was carrying them. That was not going anywhere. That was not threatened by anything I felt for anyone else. I put my hat back on. I said, "Thank you, Ruth, for everything, for choosing me in the beginning when you had other options, for staying when it was hard, for teaching me that a man can be more than he thinks he is if the right person is paying attention." I looked at the stone one more time. I said, "I am going to go back down to the house now. I am going to try to do better than I have been doing. And I think wherever you are, that is something you would call a reasonable plan." I walked back down the hill. I did not look back. Not because I was finished with her memory, not because what she had been to me was over or diminished, but because looking back had been what I did when I was standing still, and I was not standing still anymore. The following morning I rode to Whitmore alone. I left early before Nora was up, not to avoid her, but because what I needed to do on my own, as my own act, without it being about her or for her. I rode the 15 miles in the cool of the early morning and tied my horse outside the sheriff's office and went in. Burl Cassidy was at his desk. He was a large man going gray with a face that had been weathered by decades of Wyoming weather into something as permanent and difficult to read as the land itself. He looked up when I came in and something moved across his face, a brief complicated thing before it settled back into its usual impassivity. I sat down across from him without being invited. I took out the piece of paper I had written the night before by lamplight, and I placed it on the desk. He looked at it without touching it. I said, "That is a list of the documents I signed during the land transaction 2 years ago. The agent's name, the approximate dates, the content of what I understood I was signing, and what I now believe the actual purpose of those documents was. I have also written down everything I know about the North Ridge claim, about Patrick Callahan, and about Douglas Hale's acquisition of the properties in that area." Cassidy looked at the paper. I said, "I know your name is on some of the same documents. I do not know in what capacity. I am not here to make a judgment about that. I am here because I should have looked more carefully at what I was signing 2 years ago, and I did not. And a man is dead, and his daughter is living in my house trying to understand why, and I am done being the kind of man who signs things without reading them because he has decided not to care about the world." The silence in the office was very complete. Cassidy looked at the paper for a long time. Then he looked at me. He said, "You know what you are doing bringing this here." I said, "I know that Hale has connections in this county, and I know that your name is on his documents, and I know that I may be walking into your office and putting this paper in front of you and having nothing come of it, except that you pick up a telegraph and send a message to someone who will make things considerably worse for me and for Nora Callahan." I said, "I am doing it anyway." He looked at me for a moment longer, then he reached out and picked up the paper and read it. All of it, carefully, the way a man reads something that matters, going back twice over certain sections. When he finished, he set it back on the desk and looked at the middle distance for a moment, and I watched his face work through something internal, some private accounting that I was not privy to. He said, "Patrick Callahan came to see me. Before he died." I waited. He said, "He told me what Hale's man was doing. He showed me some of what he had documented. He asked me to open an inquiry." He stopped. I said, "And you did not?" He said, "Hale came to see me 3 days later. He knew Callahan had been to my office. He knew what Callahan had shown me. He told me in the pleasant, careful way that Hale has of telling people things they need to understand, that men who interfere in legitimate business transactions in this county tend to find their circumstances becoming complicated. He mentioned my wife by name. He mentioned my son's apprenticeship in Cheyenne. He looked at me directly. He said I chose my family. I am not asking you to forgive that. I am telling you the truth of it, which is what I should have told someone a long time ago. I said I am not here to forgive or condemn anything. I am here because a woman who did nothing wrong except be Patrick Callahan's daughter is sitting on a piece of land that legally belongs to her, while the man responsible for her father's death uses the courts to erase her claim to it. And I need to know whether you are going to help me stop that, or whether I am going to have to find another way. Cassidy sat with his hands flat on the desk and looked at the paper between them. He said, "What does she have?" I said, "Her father's written records. Every meeting with Hale's agent, every document he was shown, every threat made against him, all of it dated and witnessed by two men whose names the county knows. Her own land registration filed before Hale's claim existed. The names of the witnesses to both." He said, "That is enough for a federal inquiry. Not a county one. A county inquiry goes through channels Hale can reach. But a U.S. Marshal would have jurisdiction and Hale cannot touch that." I said, "Then that is what we need." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "If I send a telegram to the Marshal's office in Cheyenne, Hale will know about it within the day. He has people in the telegraph office." I said, "How long would it take for a marshal to arrive?" He said, 3 days, maybe 4. I said, "Then we have 3 or 4 days to keep Nora safe and the documents out of Hale's hands." Cassidy nodded slowly. He said, "I will send the telegram. I will word it so it does not reveal the specifics of what we have. Just that there is a matter requiring federal attention regarding land fraud in Sweetwater County." He looked at me. He said, "Mercer, I am sorry. For my part in this. For the part I did not play when I should have." I said, "Keep her safe and we will call it even." I rode home. That night I told Nora everything. All of it, the conversation with Cassidy, the telegram, the 3 or 4 days, all of it laid out plainly on the table between us, the way everything between us had finally come to be laid out without concealment and without softening. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "He will move before the marshal arrives, when he finds out about the telegram." I said, "I know." She said, "We need to keep the documents somewhere he cannot reach them, not here." I said, "Hattie's." She said, "Yes." She looked at me across the table and said, "Ethan, you did not have to do this. You did not have to go to Cassidy. You could have stayed out of it and your life would have been simpler." I said, "My life has been simple for 2 years. Simple is not the same as good." She looked at me for a long moment. The lamp between us was steady, the flame barely moving, and in the light of it, her face was open in the way it had been when she laughed at the edge of the well, the composure set aside, just a woman looking at a man. She said, "I am going to say something and I need you to hear it without arguing with me." I said, "All right." She said, "I came here under false pretenses." "Not entirely. I genuinely answered your advertisement, and I genuinely intend to be useful to you. But the full reason I came here was to find what my father left and to find who was responsible for his death. You did not agree to that. You agreed to a working arrangement, and what you have gotten is considerably more complicated than that." She paused. She said, "If you want me to leave when this is finished, when the marshal has come and the legal matter is resolved, I will understand. I will not hold you to an arrangement you entered into without knowing what it contained." I looked at her. I thought about what I had said at Ruth's grave the night before, about going back down the hill, about not standing still anymore. I said, "Nora." She waited. I said, "I went to the cemetery last night. I talked to Ruth. I have been talking to her for 2 years, but last night was different. Last night I told her what I feel when I look at you, and I told her I was sorry for the 2 years I spent disappearing into my own grief and not seeing what was happening around me, including what happened to your father. And then I walked back down the hill and I did not look back." She was very still. I said, "I am not asking you to stay because of the arrangement. I am asking you to stay because I want you here. because this ranch is better with you in it, and because I am better with you in it, and because whatever I thought I was doing when I wrote that letter, this is what I actually needed, and I was too stubborn and too scared to know how to ask for it directly." The lamp flame held steady between us. She said, "That is the most words you have said at one time since I arrived." I said, "I have been building up to it." She looked at me for a long time. Not the assessing look she had given me in the early days, not the guarded, careful look of a woman protecting herself from a situation she did not yet trust. Something quieter and more open. She said, "Ask me again when this is over, when Hale is dealt with and my father's name is cleared and the land is settled. Ask me then when I am not standing in the middle of something unresolved, and I will give you a real answer." I said, "That is fair." She said, "Good night, Ethan." I said, "Good night, Nora." Hale moved on the second day. I had expected it, but not so quickly. He must have had someone watching the telegraph office who recognized Cassidy's wire for what it was, even without the specifics, or perhaps he had someone inside the county administration who had been keeping watch for exactly this kind of development. However, he found out fast. The first sign was the smoke. Nora saw it first early in the morning of the second day after Cassidy's telegram. She was at the kitchen window with her coffee when she said quietly, "Ethan, come look at this." I came to the window and looked where she was looking northeast toward the ridge, and I saw the thin column of smoke rising against the morning sky. Not from the ranch buildings, from the direction of Hattie Greer's place. We moved fast. I hitched the horse to the single tree and we went north at the best pace the horse could manage on the dry road, and when we came over the low rise and saw Hattie's property, I felt the cold hand of dread release slightly, because it was not the house that was burning, but the small outbuilding at the back of the property, the shed where Hattie kept her tools and her preserving supplies, and as of 2 days ago the oilcloth package containing Patrick Callahan's documentation. Hattie was in the yard when we arrived, standing back from the heat, arms crossed, watching the shed burn with the expression of a woman who is furious and is managing it. I jumped down and said, "Hattie, are you hurt?" She said, "I am not hurt. I am angry, which is different and in some ways worse." 2 men came before dawn. They did not knock. Nora was beside me now. She said, "The package." Hattie looked at her with those sharp gray eyes. She said, "I moved it last night. After you left the other day, I thought about where the obvious place to look would be, and I decided not to put it there." She reached into the pocket of her apron and brought out the oilcloth bundle, slightly damp from wherever she had put it entirely intact. She placed it in Nora's hands. She said, "Your father trusted me to keep this safe. I kept it safe for 8 months. I was not going to fail him in the last mile." Nora held the package and looked at Hattie and said, "Thank you. I do not have a better word than that." Hattie said, "Thank me by finishing what he started. That is the only thanks I need." We took the package and Hattie and went back to the Mercer Ranch because Hattie's place was no longer safe, and I was not leaving her there alone, and the old woman came without argument, which told me something about how seriously she was taking the situation, because Hattie Greer was not in the habit of going anywhere without argument. I sent a rider to Whitmore that afternoon, a boy from the neighboring property who sometimes did odd jobs for me, with a note for Cassidy saying that Hale had escalated and asking for the marshal's estimated arrival. The boy came back 3 hours later with Cassidy's reply. The marshal had departed Cheyenne the previous afternoon. 2 days, perhaps less. 2 days. I looked at Nora. She looked at me. We were in the barn when the boy delivered the message, standing in the shade with the cattle shifting in the stalls around us and the late afternoon light coming through the gaps in the boards in long dusty bars. She said, "He will not wait 2 days." I said no. She said, "He will come here. He will come with paperwork. His kind always comes with paperwork first. A court order, an eviction notice, something that looks legal from a distance. And then if the paperwork does not work, something else." I said, "He has been patient for 25 years. Whatever he is carrying, he has been carrying it for a long time, and knowing we have contacted the marshal will tell him that patience is no longer a strategy." She said, "So what do we do?" I said, "We do not run. Running tells him the ground we are standing on is not solid. The ground is solid. Your father made it solid. She said, he has the county recorder and possibly the sheriff. I said, he had the sheriff. I do not think he has him anymore. She was quiet for a moment. She said, you trust Cassidy. I said, I trust that he is more tired of being afraid than he is afraid of what stops being afraid will cost him. That is a specific kind of trustworthiness, not unconditional but real. She thought about this. She said, all right. We stay. We prepared that evening the way people prepare for weather they know is coming calmly and thoroughly without wasted motion. I checked the rifle and the shotgun. Nora checked her Winchester. Hattie, who surprised me by producing a small revolver from somewhere about her person, checked that as well and said nothing about it, which I thought was correct. We ate supper together, the three of us, at the table that had held 2 people for 2 years and now held 3, and the conversation was careful and ordinary, the conversation of people who have agreed not to spend the hours before difficulty in anticipation of it, but to use those hours for something better. Hattie told us about her husband Clarence, whom she had met in Ohio in 1840 and followed west because he asked her to, and she had never been west and thought she might as well. She told it the way old people tell stories about their lives when they have decided the time for telling them has arrived, with a directness and an absence of self-consciousness that younger people rarely manage. Nora listened with her chin in her hand and asked questions that opened things up rather than closing them down. And I sat at the table I had sat at alone for 2 years and thought about how a space is defined not by its dimensions, but by who occupies it. They came the following morning. 3 men. Hale in the center, flanked by 2 others I did not recognize, men with the careful, expressionless quality of hired people who have been hired for purposes that do not require explanation. They came on horseback, not in a hurry, the way men come when they believe the situation is already resolved, and they are merely arriving to confirm it. I was on the porch. Nora was behind me, slightly to my left, with her rifle not raised but present. Hattie was inside at the window. Hale drew up in the yard and looked at the porch and at the 2 of us on it, and whatever he felt about that arrangement he kept behind the pleasant, composed expression he always wore, the face he had constructed over decades of getting what he wanted. He said, Mercer, I have a court order here from Judge Albright in Whitmore authorizing me to take possession of all documents pertaining to mineral rights claims on the North Ridge of Sweetwater County on the grounds that those documents may constitute fraudulent filings. I am also authorized to detain any individuals found to be in illegal possession of those documents. He held up a folded paper. I said, read me the judge's name again. He said, Judge Albright. I said, Alton Albright retired 8 months ago. His replacement is Judge Cecily Marsh, who has been on the bench since October. Any order signed by Albright after October is not worth the paper it is on. Hale looked at the paper in his hand. Just for a moment, just the smallest adjustment, the look of a man who has been handed something he did not check closely enough. He recovered. He said, a procedural matter. The substance of the order is valid under county law regardless of which judge signed it. I said, then you can bring it to U.S. Marshal Thomas Aldrich, who arrived in Whitmore this morning at 6 o'clock and is currently in Sheriff Cassidy's office reviewing a formal complaint filed yesterday against Douglas Hale for land fraud, falsification of county records, and the suspicious death of Patrick Callahan. I imagine he will be very interested in looking at your court order. The yard was very quiet. Hale sat on his horse in the middle of that quiet and looked at me, and I watched him work through it, the rapid internal accounting of a man discovering that the situation he believed he controlled has been changing under his feet for longer than he knew. His 2 men sat their horses without expression, waiting. He said, you are making a serious mistake. I said I made a serious mistake 2 years ago when I signed my name to a document without reading it. I have been trying to correct it ever since. This morning I think I got it right. He said, this is not finished. I said no. It will be finished in a federal court with a federal judge, with Patrick Callahan's documentation in evidence and the testimony of every man in this county who signed something they did not fully understand because you or your agents put it in front of them at a bad moment. It will take a while, and it will be uncomfortable, but it will be finished correctly. He looked at me for a long moment. Then his eyes moved to Nora standing at my left with her rifle and her father's package, and I watched something happen in his face, something that went deeper than calculation, something that was about the 25 years before any of this started, the shape of a life redirected by a single refusal, the wound a man carries when he has convinced himself the wound is a grievance rather than a grief. He looked at her, and she looked back at him steady and unafraid, and whatever he saw in her face was apparently not what he had hoped to see, because the pleasant expression finally closed down entirely, replaced by something tired and diminished and unexpectedly human. He turned his horse. He rode out of the yard without speaking again, his 2 men following, and I stood on the porch and watched them go and felt the tension leave my body in a long, slow release, like air going out of something that had been holding too much pressure for too long. Nora came to stand beside me. We watched the 3 horses diminish down the road until they were small and then gone. She said, "Is it over?" I said, "The hard part is over. The legal part will take a while." She said, "That is what my father would have called a cautious answer." I said, "Your father sounds like he was a careful man." She said, "He was. He was also stubborn and occasionally wrong, and he used to burn the biscuits because he refused to believe that the stove in his last place cooked differently than the stove in his previous place." She said it the way you say things about people when you have stopped performing the grief of them and started simply having them back in memory in the ordinary accumulated texture of a life that included them. I said, "We should go into town. Cassidy will want the documentation, and we should be there when the marshal begins taking statements." She said yes, but we did not move immediately. We stood on the porch in the morning light side by side, and the land stretched out before us brown and wide and dry exactly as it had been on every other morning, and also somehow different, the difference that comes not from anything external changing, but from something internal, completing some accounting, reaching its final column. Hattie came out behind us and stood on the step and looked out at the land and said to no one in particular, "It is going to rain before the end of the week. I can feel it in the way the air sits." I looked at the sky. It was the same blue it always was. But Hattie had been reading Wyoming weather for 40 years, and she was right more often than she was wrong. The legal proceedings took 3 months. I will not make them longer in the telling than they need to be because the details of federal land fraud cases are not what this story is about. What it is about is what happened underneath the proceedings and alongside them in the daily life of the Mercer Ranch during those 3 months, and I will tell you that as plainly as I told you everything else. The marshal's investigation confirmed what Patrick Callahan's documentation had established. The county recorder who had accepted Hale's filing while ignoring the prior Callahan registration resigned and cooperated with federal authorities in exchange for reduced consequences. 3 other men came forward with similar accounts of documents signed under pressure, their testimonies adding weight and specificity to what Nora had brought from Hattie's oilcloth package. Hale's lawyers argued for 6 weeks that the Callahan registration was invalid on technical grounds. The federal judge disagreed. Nora's name was confirmed on the Northridge claim properly and permanently in writing that could not be undone. Douglas Hale was indicted on 4 counts of land fraud and 1 count of conspiracy in the death of Patrick Callahan. It was during the 2nd week of the federal proceedings that the marshal's investigator told me something I had not known. He said the parcel you sold in 1881, the 40 acres on your northern boundary, was the one piece Hale could not acquire any other way. Without it, Nora's claim on the North Ridge was legally isolated, surrounded on 3 sides by land Hale already controlled but unreachable from any public road without crossing that parcel. Your signature, the investigator said, was the hinge the whole arrangement turned on. I sat with that for a long time after he left. I had signed my name in grief and inattention, not knowing what I was doing, and that signature had been the key that unlocked everything Hale needed. Not the land itself, the access, the legal corridor that made his consolidation of the North Ridge possible. Without my 40 acres, he had a claim he could not use. With it, he had everything. The investigator said it absolved me of wrongdoing. Duress, he called it, signed under conditions of bereavement without full disclosure of purpose. I did not feel absolved. I felt what I deserved to feel, which was responsible. Not guilty in the legal sense, but responsible in the human one. The kind of responsible that does not go away when a court says it is not your fault, because courts measure different things than the ones that matter most to a man at 3 in the morning. What helped was not the absolution. What helped was Nora, who heard the whole of it that evening and said only my father's letter mentioned you as someone who might have information or might be someone Hale approached. He did not know which. Now we know you were both. And he also said you were not her enemy. He was right about that. The rest of it you have already answered by being here. I will not tell you that justice was clean and complete because it rarely is. Hale was a wealthy man with capable lawyers, and the proceedings were long and the outcome was partial. He did not go to prison. Not ultimately, but he was fined, substantially stripped of the North Ridge properties, and left the county in the early spring of the following year, selling his holdings and his businesses, and departing with considerably less than he had arrived with, and the 25-year wound he had been carrying finally closed, or at least stopped bleeding, which is sometimes the best that wounds can do. Sheriff Burl Cassidy gave full testimony to the marshal and was not prosecuted, a decision I thought was correct. He served out the remainder of his term and did not seek re-election, retiring to a small property near the creek, and I sometimes saw him in town, and we nodded to each other with the particular understanding of men who have both made bad decisions in circumstances that made bad decisions easy and have chosen to do better when the opportunity arose. It rained on the Friday of that week as Hattie had predicted, the first rain in 4 months. It came in the afternoon, a proper Wyoming downpour that hammered the roof and ran off the eaves in sheets and turned the yard to mud and soaked the ground to a depth that would mean something that would stay in the earth long enough to change what the earth could do. I was in the barn when it started, and I stood in the barn door and watched it come down and felt something I had not felt in 3 years. Something close to gratitude, the uncomplicated gratitude of a person who has been without something necessary long enough to understand its value completely. Nora came and stood beside me. We watched the rain together, and after a while she said, "The new well is going to be very happy." I said, "I expect it is." She said, "The garden will have a fighting chance if we get it planted in the next 2 weeks." I said, "I think we can manage that." She said, "The North Ridge claim, once it is settled, I have been thinking about what to do with it. The silver deposit my father found is real, but it is small. Not enough to mine profitably, probably. But the land itself is good land. High pasture." I said, "Good cattle country up there, yes?" She said, "I thought we might fence it properly and move part of the herd up in the summer when the lower pastures are dry. Rotate the grazing." I said, "That is a good idea." She said, "It was my father's land. I would like to do something useful with it. Something that would have made sense to him." I said, "I think that would make sense to him." The rain came down, and the yard filled with the smell of wet earth. The particular smell that only comes when ground that has been too dry for too long finally receives what it needs. The smell of something that has been waiting, becoming something that is happening. I said, "Nora." She said, "Yes." I said, "This is over. The hard part. It is not entirely finished in the courts, but the shape of it is settled, and you know what the outcome is going to be. Your father's name will be cleared. The land is yours." She said, "Yes." I said, "I asked you a few weeks ago to let me ask you again when this was over." She turned to look at me. The rain was a curtain behind her, and the light was gray and soft, and the mud in the yard was the darkest color mud can be when it is newly wet. I said, "I want you to stay, not because of the arrangement and not because of the work, though both of those things are true. I want you to stay, because this place has been a house for 2 years, and it is a home now, and the difference is you. Because I wake up in the morning and the first thing I think about is not what needs to be done, but whether you have already started the coffee. And that is the kind of thinking that means something. Because you are the most honest person I have ever known, and the most capable person I have ever worked beside, and I am 40 years old, and I thought I knew what my life was going to be, and you arrived and showed me I was wrong in the best possible way." She was very still. I said, "I love you. That is what I am saying. I am saying it plainly because you are a person who deserves things said plainly." The rain fell. She looked at me for a long moment the way she had looked at me that first day on the station platform, the steady measuring look of a woman who is taking the full measure of a situation before she commits to it. Only it was different now. It was the look of a woman who already knows the answer and is simply allowing herself to feel the full weight of it before she says it. She said, "I came here looking for what my father left. I found it. I also found something I was not looking for, which is what you are." She said, "I love you too, Ethan. I have for longer than I admitted to myself, which is a habit of mine that I am trying to break." I said, "You can work on it here." She said, "I intend to." I reached out and she took my hand, and we stood in the barn door in the rain with our hands together, and the whole of the ranch around us, the new well and the mended fences and the cattle in the stalls, and the garden plot that would be planted in 2 weeks, and the North Ridge land that would be fenced in the spring, all of it present and accountable, all of it ours. We were married on a Sunday in October on the porch of the Mercer Ranch in the presence of Hattie Greer and Burl Cassidy and a traveling minister who had the good sense to keep the ceremony short and the words honest. The sky was the deep, clear blue of Wyoming autumn, a different blue than the summer blue, cooler and more forgiving, and the hills to the west had gone gold with the season, and the grass in the yard had come back thin and green from the September rains, the first green it had shown in months. Hattie cried. She denied this afterward and continued to deny it for as long as I knew her, but I saw it and Nora saw it, and we had the grace not to mention it. Cassidy shook my hand with the grip of a man who has something to say and is saying it through the grip rather than the words, and I received it in that spirit. We had a meal afterward, the 4 of us at the table that had once seated 1 and then 2 and now seated 4, with the windows open to the October air and the smell of the food and the sound of Hattie telling a story about the first winter she had spent in Wyoming that had everyone laughing by the end of it, and the afternoon light moving across the floor and the world outside, green and possible. I sat at that table and looked at the woman beside me, my wife, and thought about the letter I had written by lamplight in this same room, asking for someone plain and practical and undemanding, asking for someone who would not make me feel anything I was not prepared to feel. I thought about how precisely wrong I had been about what I needed, and how precisely right the thing I had received was. People ask me sometimes, people who hear the story secondhand and want it confirmed or corrected, whether I have any regrets, whether I wish things had gone differently, been simpler, cost less. I tell them no. I tell them that the land had been trying to tell me something for 11 years, and I had been looking in the wrong place, and it took a woman who knew how to read what was underneath the surface to show me where the water actually was. I tell them that some things look like drought and are just waiting. I tell them that the most important letter I ever wrote was the one asking for what I thought I needed, because what came back was something so much better that I would not have known how to ask for it directly, and that sometimes that is exactly how it has to work. That is what I tell them. Then I go inside to the house that is a home to the woman who made it one, and I put the kettle on, and we sit across from each other at the table by the window with the Wyoming evening coming in, and there is nothing empty in the room. There is nothing empty anywhere.